everyone. This is Piero San Giorgio. Today I have the great pleasure to host my friend James Howard Kunstler with us today. Hello, Jamie. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well, Piero. Nice to talk to you.
Well, congratulations for your most recent book, which I have in my hand here, Living in the Long Emergency, the long-awaited, let's say, follow-up, if you can say, to your best-selling book, The Long Emergency. I read the book over the last few days when I received it. We're going to talk about the content, but I just wanted to say first, as a fellow author, even if English is not my main mother language, but I found that the writing skill from all your books, in fact, keeps getting better and better. I'm just impressed. And as I was reading the parts of the book when we're going to talk about this, where you talk about some of the people you meet and you tell the stories, it reminded me in the style of those American Gothic authors such as Truman Capote, and I found the writing excellent, really an amazing style and a very enjoyable read.
Well, thank you. You know, it's very interesting because I actually make quite an effort to bring some conscious artistry to this job of writing books and writing blogs and essays. And back in the days when there was a book review industry, which, by the way, doesn't really exist anymore because the newspapers have either gone out of business or cut down on their staff a lot. But back in those days, the reviewers never noticed that my books were well written. They also never noticed that they were funny, and it used to annoy me a lot. So I take it's particularly I'm particularly grateful that you noticed that they were well written.
Well, and it's truthful. So this book is the follow-up to The Long Emergency.
It's a follow-up and a half. It's a follow-up and a half because I actually published a previous book in 2012 called Too Much Magic, which was about wishful thinking and technology. And, you know, it was, in a way, a follow-up to The Long Emergency, but not exactly.
Mm-hmm. It was a great book. We translated into French, and we published it in France. And indeed, it's also, as I told you when we chatted last time, this book is also the origin story, in a way. I found it this way, a sort of origin story of the series of your novels, A World Made by Hand. It kind of links The Long Emergency to your fiction. Even if there's no fiction in this book, there are great interviews of people who are preparing, in a way, or trying to struggle through this long emergency, which is already very real for many of them.
Yeah.
What was the process of imagining the structure of the book and going through these people and these stories, which are very touching, some of them, I must say?
Well, thank you very much. It wasn't very complicated. I wanted to achieve three things. I wanted to comment on what I had written in 2005 in the Long Emergency book, the first book, and discuss how things had played out over 15 years and what I missed and what I got wrong and what I had gotten right, and discuss the changes of developments since then in many of the areas that I talked about, like the oil situation, you know, the world resources situation, the political quandaries of the time, etc. The second objective was to create portraits of individuals who were leading alternative lifestyles and had made choices because they understood that we were entering a strange period of human history. And the third part was I wanted to do a little forecasting about what to expect in the time ahead, now that we have pretty much entered the long emergency. The most ironic thing of all, probably, is that the book was published just about the very day that the COVID-19 virus caused the United States to shut down its economy pretty much.
Mm-hmm.
And so you might say in a way that was it was published the actual day that the long emergency began in earnest.
Yes. In the first part of the book, indeed, you update where we stand in this long emergency, and even before, of course, the recent events and the recent economic shutdown, and which we are at the beginning of its effects, really.
Yeah.
You already show that there were many industries who were completely bankrupt and doomed to failure. And this is only accelerating the inevitable fall of the huge consumption economy that we thrive in, the happy motoring years that we do. What are the main where in your opinion, and as you write in the book, where do we stand in that process?
Well, for one thing, the financial sector of the economy, which is a subsystem of the larger economy of doing and making things, the financial system was already in a great deal of trouble, largely because of the debt accumulation all around the world, and particularly in the Western democracies and in China. And that system was already wobbling under the weight of all that debt. And in September, we had an incident in the American bond markets and in the American banking system where the interest rates on short-term lending shot up very quickly for no apparent reason. The reason actually was that the big banks who customarily did overnight loans with each other to help them cover their ongoing currency flows. The big banks refused to lend to each other all of a sudden. And so the Federal Reserve had to step in and be the lender of last resort for the short-term overnight loans. And it didn't just happen for one day or 1 week. That lending, that extraordinary amount of lending, and the volume of it was tremendous. It was tens and sometimes hundreds of billions of dollars in a week. Went on from September until the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis. So there was already a tremendous amount of money created out of thin air by the Federal Reserve going into the financial system well before the virus started its own interruptions. So, there's the financial system, which is a part of our economy that has been in trouble for over a decade, and it cannot find its way out. It tried to find its way out since 2009 with just a heroic amount of money printing by all central banks, including China's. And China, by the way, has a banking system that, unlike the Western banking systems, they don't even have to pretend to answer to any authority because they are a captive of the Communist Party of China. In the United States and in Europe, we at least pretend that the banking authorities have to answer to the political authorities, although there's not very much of it, and they've kind of joined forces now to both pretend that that the problems don't exist and can be cured by accumulating more debt. So that was an enormous part of the problem. Then there was the oil and the energy part of the problem. I wrote a great deal in 2005 in the Long Emergency book about the Peak Oil Quandary. And peak oil was really kind of misunderstood. It was never about running out of oil. It was really the fact that the cost of getting the remaining oil out of the ground was going up at a rate that indicated we would not be able to run our industrial economies by the way that the cost of getting the oil out of the ground. And it was, that ratio, which is often known as the energy cost of energy, the amount of energy it costs to get the energy out of the ground, that ratio was going up. So, we back in the 1950s, generally the world got 100 barrels of oil back for every equivalent 1 barrel of oil it put into the task of getting the oil out of the ground. That ratio now is about 17 to 1. And for shale oil, it's really bad. It's about 5 to 1. Tar sands are even worse. And the United States had undertaken this shale oil project after 2009. You might remember, and your listeners might remember, that around 2008, the price of oil shot up to about 150 US dollars a barrel. That was partly because the conventional oil in the USA and in other places was beginning to, we were beginning to have a problem with it. And our production was going way down. It had been 10 million barrels a day in 1970, and we were now producing about 4.9 million barrels a day. And that's quite a drop. And we were using 20 million barrels a day. So if you do the math, we were importing about 15 million barrels a day. And that's a lot of imported oil. And it's a lot of American money going overseas to other places. So all of these things were causing disruptions and pressures on the financial markets and the members of the global economy. And then, of course, with the crisis of 2009, which I think was 2008 and 9, which was partly provoked by the high cost of oil, the price of oil went way down. And then we embarked on the shale adventure, shale oil. And the difference between the old oil and the new oil is pretty simple. The old oil, like a Texas oil well in the 1950s, cost about $400,000 in today's dollars to drill a well, and it produced thousands of barrels a day for decades. That's West Texas oil from 1950. Shale oil costs between $6 and $12 million per well to drill. It produces maybe 100 barrels a day for the first year. Then it falls off by 60%, and after 3 years, it's gone. So, it's a very expensive business. It's technologically very complex. A lot of things can go wrong. It produces relatively little compared to the kind of oil we got back in the 20th century. And the whole thing was made possible by this new regime of ultra low interest loans. And unfortunately, most of the producers of shale oil did not make any money producing shale oil. And so, we went through this interesting experiment, and it was a tremendous financial stunt. It was kind of a miraculous performance, but it was a performance. And we got the oil back from roughly 5 million barrels a day. We got the production to 13 million barrels a day in late 2019. So we surpassed the old previous American oil peak of 10 million and went way past that. And we were producing tremendous amounts of shale oil. The problem was no one was making any money producing it. And the problem was it needed continual reinvestment to keep drilling those wells, which crapped out after 3 years. And finally the problem was that the shale oil companies had spent a decade proving that they couldn't make any money. So they reached a point by 2020 where nobody wanted to lend them money anymore because it was no longer a good investment. And that's when, it really started to rock the expectations of the economy. And now, we're at a point where a lot of the shale oil companies are going bankrupt, and it's looking pretty grim for that whole endeavor.
later part of the book, and maybe then we'll come back to the meaty part of the book, which is really the people you have been meeting.
Yeah.
The later part of the book is really, now what's going to happen? And one of the things you have had a lot of prescience is that you also started that in Too Much Magic, but you are showing how the political system has no solution whatsoever to the problems we're facing. And this is worrisome, especially in an election year. We are in 2020, where a lot of people hope that whatever leader, whether it's a socialist, whether it's an orange man, will bring all the solutions to the problems, and it's just impossible.
Yes, the intractable nature of this set of problems has a parallel in the political system. And I think you can say that the craziness of the political system has increased in a direct proportion to the difficulties of the problem, the difficulties that the problems present. And the craziness has reached a level in the United States that is now quite extreme. On the one hand, we have the political problem of the so-called Russiagate scandal, which was really, to be perfectly blunt about it, it was an attempt by the intelligence services and the Department of Justice and the FBI to overthrow Mr. Trump. I was not a big Trump supporter or a big Trump fan, but I was very much against the efforts that were made to overthrow him. And I do believe that we need to correct that by prosecuting the people who did it. It has been an extremely difficult task to get to that point, where we seem to be getting there now with a new attorney general. But for 3 years, the regime obstructed every attempt to correct this set of problems. And it created a tremendous amount of ill will in the American political system. On the other hand, you have the opposing party, the Democratic Party, as it's called in America. And the Democratic Party employed such a degree of dishonesty and bad faith in this coup attempt that they have quite destroyed their credibility. And they are now pretty much the party of dishonest politics and of bad faith with the public. And I think we're at a turning point now where even the people who don't like Mr. Trump and have never admired him and find him to be a disagreeable character, even they are going to discover that a very bad thing happened in the United States. And you also have another dynamic going on, which is the Democratic Party nominating this fellow, Joe Biden, the former vice president, for the election campaign. And he's pretty obviously not right in the head.
Yeah.
It's pretty clear to just about everybody over the age of 7 that he really doesn't have the capacity to run for president or serve as president. And the Democratic Party has been pretending that he's okay for the last several months. And it's a pathetic exercise. It's really so bad that it's like the fairy tale of the emperor's new clothes, where absolutely everybody in the society can tell that something is wrong, and they just can't bring themselves to say so. And that's what's going on with them. I don't think that Mr. Biden will be the nominee, but what this portends is a very disorderly resolution of the Democratic Party's prospects for election. Who are they going to dredge up to take his place when it finally becomes obvious that he can't run? And not only is he probably somewhat senile, but he has this tremendous train of scandal behind him from China and Ukraine that is going to be, that's going to come back to bite him. So I don't think that he's a viable candidate at all. And the only thing that I can truly imagine is that Hillary Clinton is going to somehow insert herself back into the political scene, and that will be another catastrophe for the party. And so I think the party may just die. It may just commit suicide, like sometimes political parties do. The Jacobins committed suicide in France in 1793, yep. And the Whigs committed suicide in the USA in 1856, and now the Democrats look like they're going to commit suicide. I'm sorry, but did you ask me another question on top of that? I forget.
No, it's that indeed the politics seem to not bring any solution, and even if they have someone very competent and with a competent team, it seems that the inertia of the political game. And even the nature itself of the game makes it just impossible that any serious vital topic in the next few years is tackled. I mean, and it's becoming more and more obvious that the concern of most of the people, and even if it would, the concern of most of the people is not about preparing for the long emergency, and we'll go into the middle part of your book, but the concern is, how do I keep consuming and growing and enjoying and having more and more bad food and traveling, and it seems that there is a massive cognitive dissonance across not just the United States, it's really globally, and it's very worrisome for the next few years.
Yes, and the disappointment that will come out of this, it will be epic. What you're saying, I think, is that there's a general expectation that we will simply return to what used to be the normal patterns of production and consumption, and we won't. And a big part of the baggage that that you defined as inertia is this tremendous amount of global debt that we've racked up, which is going to make it, impossible to capitalize even the changes that we might make if we were thinking straight. So, even if we were able to marshal our attention and our energy and our political will to look at the problems that we have and do something about them, the problem will probably have a lot to do with the capital not being there, for public projects or public works, or indeed even for the maintenance of things that we already have. One of the big issues for us, probably globally, because it's not just the U.S., is how are these cities going to maintain their infrastructures and their social services spending? The social services in the USA are a little bit different from the social services in Europe, which have mostly been in Europe for, healthcare and other public goods. Mm-hmm. In the U.S., it has more to do with just supporting populations of idle people. But how are the cities going to fix their transportation systems, their subways, their sewers and electric and water? And, we already see you could already see in the United States that the cities had attained a scale that was incongruent with the resource and capital realities of the future. The money wasn't going to be there, and the capital, the resources weren't going to be there. One of the more grotesque manifestations of this was the skyscraper orgy that we went through in the last 2 decades, especially in New York City. And people didn't understand that these buildings we were putting up, these megastructures, are not assets. They're overnight they've become liabilities. Especially the ones in New York that were built over the last several years, these slender pencil-like towers that are strictly, residential towers for billionaires. And, these things get financed and permitted in 3 years before they're built. And then they get built and the world changes, and all of a sudden they're liabilities. They can't sell the units. Countries have put capital controls on their population so that foreign people cannot come in and buy these condominiums. So now you've got all these empty skyscrapers in New York that will not be inhabited, or they'll be sold for pennies on the dollar or dimes on the dollar. And then you have the whole situation aggravated with the virus, which is now driving people out of the city. We have the additional problem in the United States with our suburbs. We have so many people living in these suburban wastelands that, including most of our middle class. And once they become impoverished, which is underway, they're not going to be able to even use these living arrangements. They're not going to be able to buy the cars or pay the mortgages on these gigantic houses. And that whole system is going to get into trouble. Now, there are alternatives to that, which I propose, but I don't think anybody takes them seriously. And what I'm proposing is that we're going to have to return to small towns that are real towns, not suburbs, and places that have a meaningful relationship with agriculture, and places that exist along the important waterways, because we're going to have to move more things on boats in the future than in trucks. The trucking industry is going to get into trouble. This whole panorama of problems that involve our living arrangement generally we're going to face tremendous changes with these things, and the solutions to these things are there, but we don't want to pay attention to them, and especially in the USA. For example, nobody has any interest in America to rebuild the conventional railroad system. It's too late to build a high-speed rail system in America. We missed the opportunity for that when there was a lot of capital around. But nobody even has any interest in rebuilding the old conventional railroad system, and we're going to need it desperately because the whole happy motoring thing is over. And it's not, and ironically, it's not over because of the fuel problem, because of the gasoline problem or a shortage of oil. It's ending because Americans are used to buying cars on installment loans, and every day there are fewer and fewer credit-worthy Americans in the failing middle class who will qualify for loans. So that whole way of even acquiring cars is over with, and it's not going to be solved by electric cars or by Uber or, anything like that. So, the signs are pretty clear, and but we're not paying attention, and it's going to be very difficult to get through this thing. My guess is that the friction that arises out of these failures is going to lead to a lot of political disorder and violence. That's what happens when you get a lot of friction. You get heat where you get heat. Sometimes you get fire.
Absolutely. And let me plug in for you one of your earlier books, which I think it's very relevant today and people should read it, which is The Geography of Nowhere, and which was a brilliant book on what you just described. Now, you mentioned a lot of people who should follow some of the advice and premises that you, but myself and many others are starting to give to people. And you have done what I think is a great exercise to interview some of them. And some are, I must say that some of these stories of your encounters are very touching. They are very humane, and they show in good and bad, I mean, in good fortunes and bad fortunes, the state of some of the people who go through the end of American dream. It is, if such thing ever existed in reality, but it's some of these stories are very hopeful for the future. They give very interesting ideas, and some of them are, yeah, I guess they are hopeful, but they also show the very difficult emotional state that people have to go through in the last 10 years. I thought you did a great exercise there. Can you tell us a little bit on those people?
Yeah.
And what they're doing?
Yeah, first of all, these people were not celebrities. They were not people who were well known for doing anything particularly. They were normal people in some ways. In some ways, they were special or abnormal, but mostly, they were people that had at least started out in life in the world as normal American types. They all had one thing in common. They were brave about going about what they did and about making the choices that they did. And some of them were extreme, and some of them were following paths that were that one might expect from the scenarios that we spin out. For example, one lady I was particularly drawn to was a woman who is a artisan baker in Vermont, and
Yes.
her name was Suzanne, and she had been through many vicissitudes and hardships in order to do what she's doing, but she was so determined to do it, and I admired her so much for doing it, and she was so brave, and especially in the sense that she wanted to put out a first-rate product in a culture that didn't particularly appreciate it very much, and yet, she doggedly stuck to it. She went out of business several times, had many reverses. It continues to have problems even after I finished telling her story, especially with the virus. That's interrupted her life as a professional baker and her markets and everything. Anyway, I admired her tremendously. There were a couple of homesteaders out in Washington State who lived near the Pacific Ocean on an island, and they were very smart people. But they were very ordinary people in some ways. Well, is a child there? Piero?
Yeah, she's gone. Sorry for the introduction.
Oh, that's right. So they were very smart people, but normal people, and they had created a homestead with a great deal of care and a great deal of pluck. And they both had very complicated lives. So they were around 50 or 60. One was 50, the other was 60. And they put up this whole establishment of a homestead near the sea on Whidbey Island. And after I finished writing about them, they called me up and said, "You know what? We have to move from here." And they discovered that the naval station on Whidbey Island was going to be made much larger, and the Navy jets were flying many more airplanes over their house than had been the case, and they decided they just had to get out of there. So they sold the place for a very good sum of money and moved all the way across the country to Vermont to be near the woman's sister. And they sold their homestead in a very wealthy market. And they bought a homestead in Vermont in one of the poorest corners of New England. So they started all over again, and it's testimony to how brave they were. Another guy who some readers had problems with him, and I think understandably. He was a white nationalist living in a kind of a backwater of the state of Connecticut. And he was running a taxi cab company, mostly conveying um, poor people and drug addicts to their medical appointments, and trying hard to make a living. But he told me his story of what he had gone through and the conclusions that he'd come to about politics and ethnicity and race. And I put him in the book because I thought that people ought to know what was going through the head of a person like him. I'd corresponded with him for many years before. He was a reader of my blog, and he wrote me emails at least every year. So, I'd had some interchange with him, and I was able to see his life and his ideas develop. And I just thought, okay, well, I'll just put it out there. I'm not trying to advertise his philosophy, but I think that people need to be exposed to it. Another fellow who corresponded with me, and I found him very appealing. He was a commenter on my blog, and he had a great sense of comedy about him. He was actually a very funny writer. And he was an African-American man who lived in the Baltimore ghetto. And he was living like a character in a science fiction movie in a town that was a ghost town where there were no people left. He was living in this row house that was one of the last standing houses in a neighborhood that had just been bulldozed, and hardly anybody was there. And he was making money working for somebody who was fixing houses in another part of town. And he had carpentry skills and construction skills. And he was living in this place. It was like a spaceship. And his intelligence appealed to me, and his bravery, and the way he had adopted and formed at the age of about 54 a very coherent philosophy about how to live that was not at all like the standard ideology of racial politics in America. It was really quite different and had its own logic. And so I wanted to write about him. I thought he was an interesting character. And then there was another chap who, he was a 35-year-old guy who had gone, he once saw me give a lecture at Skidmore College near where I live. And when he left school, he got into the historic preservation industry, and he was working in that for a few years. And then he got into the newspaper business, and he was an editor for a newspaper. And then he dropped out and bought a farm and decided he was going to become a distiller, make whiskey and vodka, and that he was going to devote his life to that and raise a family on a farm, and basically drop out of a system which he had concluded did not have a very good future. The consumption life of American happy motoring and cheeseburgers. And he very bravely went off and learned to do absolutely everything on his own. He learned how to grow the right kind of corn to make the right kind of whiskey, learned how to make the whiskey himself, bought all the equipment and the big distillery vats, and never really took a course or had a mentor or anything like that. And he got into the business, and he was doing just fine. And he had met a woman and had 2 children, and she had another child of her own from another marriage, and they were living on this little homestead. And it was very heartwarming to see how he managed that. And and then there was the guy in Wisconsin, Mark Shepard, who is a fairly well-known alternative agriculture guy who promotes a form of farming that he calls silviculture, which means cultivating trees. Mm-hmm. And he's planted an experimental farm in this region of Wisconsin. It's very beautiful out there, by the way. It's not flat. It's got a very interesting topography because there was very little glaciation there. And he's got this farm which is mostly consists of chestnut trees and filbert trees, and then an understory of other things, berries and other crops that he grows. And he's especially interested in and expert in the hydrology of farmland, and he's published several books about how to direct the water on farmland in a useful way that allows you to conserve the rainfall. Because in America, in a lot of America, the farmers just, they everything is tuned to the grid that was imposed on the American landscape in the 1800s, and they don't, even the farm fields are also they also conform to the grid. So a lot of the water just runs away, and they plow the fields up, and the water runs away, and the topsoil runs away with it into the Mississippi River. And so he has this whole system for contouring the land and directing the water flows. And he also had a very interesting history. He had, as a young man, he had spent several years homesteading in one of the most remote regions of Alaska. And he had had many adventures and misadventures doing that. And his upbringing was a little strange too, because his parents were deeply involved with the anthroposophists, if I'm saying that right, kind of quasi-religious, spiritual growth movement. And they had a kind of agricultural branch to them, where they were kind of the people who invented organic farming in America in the 1930s and 40s. And so he came out of that world. And so, those are the
all
people
these
who
stories.
Yeah.
No, please continue.
No, those are the people I wrote about. I had corresponded with almost all of them before the interviews, so I knew them a little from writing. But then I got to know them. I traveled to where they were, and I watched what they did.
Yeah, the all these stories I thought were very, very interesting, and you put a lot of I think of heart into getting out the deep feelings and thoughts that and in a very respectful way as well. You never, and there's no reason, but you don't make fun of them. It doesn't come out of you are very respectful of their struggles, of their approach, and I think the readers of your book will find interesting ideas on even sometimes of the pitfalls that can happen, and obviously to try to avoid, but generally some good virtuous examples of even the one I know today it's considered very negatively to be the white nationalist, but I thought he was very smart, and in a way he became more reasonable over time. And I think that the struggle of working and preparing for difficult times basically mellows people into some less ideological approach to whatever thoughts one have, but to more practical. And in the end, you have to grow your food. You have to make a living in a more local way, and this is hard work. You don't have time for big ideologies there, whether it's left, right, whatever. And yeah. I thought this came out pretty neatly.
Yeah, I think what was common among all of them was that apart from any of their political beliefs, which by the way, were not very, they didn't wear them on their sleeve, as we say. They all had an apprehension. Mm-hmm. They all had a very clear apprehension that modern life was changing in a very deep, profound way, and that they had to do something in order to live in the world that was being born. And especially the ones who had children, were very they were very concerned about how their children were going to make it into that new transformed world. So,
yes. So I remind our listeners that James Howard Kunstler's latest book, Living in the Long Emergency, is a book that you should read, and that is really taking over. And as I say, it's making the link between the long emergency and Too Much Magic to the novels World Made by Hand, which seem to be a future more and more likely to all of us in the next maybe decade or two. So
yeah, I feel like I'm living through what they call in Hollywood the prequel to World Made by Hand. Now that the virus has done its thing.
Yeah, it definitely brought us one more step into that process, and I think a lot of people are feeling it, and they felt the scare, and now they are feeling the economic reality that is catching everywhere, despite the stock market. The reality is that it's becoming very hard for a lot of businesses and people, and we're at the beginning of a long process, which could accelerate or not, but certainly that process is difficult to change direction. I thank you very much for your time, and
a pleasure.
People can find your book easily online or to your website. And once again, it's really a great book to have and read, and I advise it.
Okay,
Thanks
well,
a lot.
Thank you very much, Piero.
And we'll speak again.
Okay. Shall we go back to the